else for joining us this evening. And so today we will be presenting about life in flux or evolution, ecology, and the impact of a changing planet. So for some background, Sciences and News is a graduate student-run organization where grad students and postdocs present exciting scientific topics to the general public. Today we're interested in life in flux or how climate change affects the world around us, as well as how climate change as well affects us to have an impact as well. And so today we'll be dealing with a macro scale, dealing with population species to the human level, and then finally to the microscopic molecular level. So the format of the talks will be 15 minutes each, 3 speakers, and please hold your questions until the very end where you can ask questions about all three presentations. And so to introduce, will be our speakers today, where we have Jonathan, who will present about how climate change affects the waking of monkeys, Jordan, who will discuss climate change at the human level, exploring how the rise in global temperatures affects mosquitoes and the spread of diseases. And then finally, Grayson, who will discuss the microscopic level of climate change by discussing how we can modify algae to develop living solar panels. So you may be wondering, what is climate change? And so to start off, climate change is the long-term shift in our weather patterns due to either the natural processes or human activity. It causes rapid shifts in the environment, ranging from hotter temperatures, more wildfires, severe storms, more droughts, and the melting of the polar ice caps. Next, you may be wondering, why should we care about this and what can we do about it? And so these shifts directly impact nature and us directly, such as a decline in certain species, our health, such as in the increase of certain diseases, and a decrease in healthy food and water availability. But knowing how climate change directly impacts us can help us develop tools to reduce the effects of climate change and for us to adapt to climate change, such as developing solar panels, using wind energy, or combating diseases, or understanding how animals evolve and adapt. So today we'll dive into the question of how does climate change affect us and what are we going to do about it? So today you'll hear about 3 ways climate change affects us and how we can adapt to these changes. So first off, Jonathan will talk about, is climate change making monkeys gain weight? Jordan will then discuss how climate change affects us at the human level, exploring how the increase in the temperature leads to how mosquitoes affects the spread of diseases. And then finally, Grayson will talk about living solar panels or how we can use algae as solar panels. So to start off, Jonathan will start off about monkeys and gaining weight.
Alrighty. Thank you for that introduction. Let me share my screen. Slideshow. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Jonathan Pertile. I am a second-year PhD graduate student in the Department of Anthropology at Yale University. And here today, I'm going to be talking about whether global warming is making monkeys gain weight. So to hop right into it, Bergman's rule is going to be something that we come back to a few times today. It's generally the observation that the further a species is from the equator, on average, the larger its body size. A really famous example of this observation are with penguins. If you look at the Galapagos penguins, which live near the equator, they're going to be a lot smaller than the emperor penguins that live year-round in Antarctica. And why are species further from the equator bigger? We think it's because of heat. The reason is smaller animals have more skin to mass ratio, so they disperse more heat relative to the amount of heat that they retain in their body. These bigger species tend to retain, on average, more heat relative to how much they disperse, making it advantageous to be bigger in colder areas. If you extend that across time, You might think that if it's advantageous to be cold or to be large where it's cold and small where it's warm, that as climate change makes it warmer, we might expect species to get smaller. So if temperature is really causing these body size changes, then global warming should lead to changing and smaller body sizes. To explore this prediction a little bit more, we're going to be looking at Azara's owl monkeys. These monkeys are really cute and they live in the Gran Chaco region of South America. This includes parts of northern Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and a little bit of Brazil. They live in small groups of 2 to 5 individuals. These groups are a monogamous pair and their offspring. And this results in 3 broader age groups. We have the youngest individuals before they have left their parents' group. Then we have these middle age group of monkeys. We call these solitary floaters. You could kind of think this as like a monkey going out to college. It hasn't found its own group yet, but it's left its parents' home. And then we have the reproductive adults. These are the individuals that have their own offspring, that they have their own breeding group. So we have been studying these species on this branch called Estancia Guayucolec in northern Argentina. It looks a lot like this. And in 1996, that's when my advisor, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez Duque, started studying them. And if you look way, way down here, there's me. I do my research here, and it's a great place to work. But what's really great about it is the owl monkeys. We already know a good amount that temperature is a really, really important influence on owl monkey biology in their lives. For example, we know that there are 11 owl monkey species, and these species tend to follow that same observation we saw with the penguins, Bergman's rule. The species that live closer to the equator, like this one, are much smaller than our fatter and fluffier friends in Argentina. We also know that of the 11 species, 10 of them are nocturnal. The one species that isn't nocturnal, which means that they're awake at night, is the one that lives in Argentina, where it's really cold. These ones are cathemeral. Cathemeral is a jargon word that means that they're awake at both day and night. And whether they're awake at day or night is predicted a lot by the temperature, in addition to the moon phase. And finally, for a cute little example of temperature being important, we know that owl monkeys choose where they sleep and whether they sleep in contact based on the temperature. So kind of obviously when it's cold, they huddle up, and when it's hot, they splay themselves out on a tree branch, all separate from each other. So how do you find out if climate change is changing body mass? Well, you measure and record a bunch of information over a long time. Most importantly, body mass or weight. We have 300 measurements of different owl monkeys from 1999 to 2023 in this data set. We also record temperature from the airport. And then we have to record some other things that might also affect body mass. Here, we all probably know that how much you eat affects your weight. We account for that by looking at how much fruit is available to each group in the forest. And we also look at births because we know that reproduction is a really important factor in influencing body mass. So to look at our data a little bit, here we have a few different columns and a few different rows. In each of these columns, we have a different age group that we talked about before. So the predispersal is going to be those youngest individuals. The floaters, that's going to be like the college-aged monkeys. And the territory holders, this is going to be the adults. So each of these goes in a different column. And we have the females in this top row and the males in the bottom row. On our vertical axis, we have mass or body weight. So up at the top, we have about 3-4 pounds down to just about a pound. And then we have that again for the males. And on our horizontal axis, we have from the start of our data around 1999 to almost present. So if we look at just these youngest individuals, what do we see? Well, we see that the individuals at the start of our study period weigh relatively less on average than the individuals during present day. And if we look at those college-age monkeys, well, they're a little less sampled, they're a little harder to find, but we do see generally the same trend. And if we look at our adult monkeys, same thing. less weight when they're a long time ago and heavier nowadays. So why are these body masses rising? What's making these monkeys gain weight? Well, could it be temperature? Because temperature is also increasing over time. Here we again have our year on our horizontal axis, and now we have the mean temperature, the average temperature in the last 365-day period of each day. And there's some missing gaps because, the people at the airport, sometimes they decide they don't want to collect data, and that's okay, I guess. But on average, we still do see an increase. Nowadays, temperatures are higher than they were 25 years ago because climate change. But these temperatures don't really seem to track with the body weight when you like dig into the data. So here we're looking at the temperature in the year immediately preceding a measurement. And we look in to see if that relates to how much the monkeys weigh. And we don't really find a correlation. In all of our columns of all our age groups and sexes, we see no relationship. We see these flat lines. But when we look at temperature during the first year of life, when these monkeys are doing the majority of their growing, and we correct for things like how old they are, that we know are going to be really influential for how much they weigh, we find that temperature starts to predict body mass a lot more. We see here in this graph on our horizontal axis, we have the mean temperature during the first year of life, with 0 being average and 1 being about a standard deviation about or like one unit away. And we have body mass on our vertical axis. And these numbers don't matter so much as the fact that there's a positive relationship. We see warmer temperatures, bigger body mass, which means that it's possible that individuals are maybe saving their weight or saving their energy and putting it on as extra weight, possibly due to climate change. And yeah, is climate change causing these owl monkeys to gain weight? Well, heavier monkeys, they're either eating more calories or they're spending fewer calories. It's the only way to gain weight. Warmer temperatures could allow for these individuals to spend fewer calories keeping warm during the cold Argentine winters. Because it gets really cold, it gets down to about freezing. So this could result in them gaining weight. But ultimately, body mass is a really complex trait affected by temperature, reproduction, food, competition with other monkeys. So there's a lot of factors that could be increasing or that could be contributing to this increase in body mass besides just climate change. But despite this complexity, temperature during development remains the best predictor of body mass. For example, when we look at how much food that is available to each of these monkeys, it doesn't seem to predict how much they weigh. So if we think back to Bergman's rule, we saw a relationship where individuals in colder areas were bigger, but now we're seeing individuals in warmer areas being bigger. That is the opposite of what Bergman's rule expected. Bergman's rule thought that individuals would weigh less to deal with hotter temperatures more efficiently. This could maybe make the individuals more vulnerable to warmer temperatures, which would not be a good thing for the survival of this population in the long run. So, what have we learned? We've learned that owl monkeys could be gaining weight as a result of climate change, although the whole monkey mass story is pretty complex. We need to continue studying the effects of climate change on the environment and its inhabitants. And we know that climate change will affect many species, not just owl monkeys. For an example of a change due to climate change with really big implications for humans, I'm going to hand it over to Jordan now. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions when we wrap up.
Hi, everyone. I am excited to talk to you today about climate change's hidden health crisis, which I'm calling the fever forecast. And I'm a second-year graduate student in the Department of Microbial Pathogenesis at the Yale School of Medicine. So, as Ashley said at the very beginning, climate change causes many things. We see global warming with rising temperatures, we see rising sea levels, We see increases in storms and flooding, like some crazy hurricanes in the past few years. And we also see drought and even wildfires, as we've most recently seen in Southern California. But something that we don't usually think of when it comes to climate change is that climate change also affects mosquitoes. So you might be thinking, why does it matter that climate change affects mosquitoes? It'd be better if mosquitoes just disappeared off the face of the earth because they bite people and they're really annoying. And I do agree with that. But I really want to talk about why it matters. And it matters because it affects us. So mosquitoes carry many different types of diseases, and I'm going to describe a few of these diseases here, which you may have heard of before or may not have heard of before. So one that is pretty well known is malaria, and this is seen a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. It causes this cyclical pattern of a high fever, and it can cause blood disorders such as anemia. And then you have dengue virus, which is in a lot of tropical areas all around the world, and it causes a high fever and joint and muscle pain. And in the most severe cases, it can cause internal bleeding. Zika virus is a virus that when pregnant women are infected with the virus, they can be at risk for having babies with birth defects. But then in non-pregnant people, it can also cause fever, rash, and joint pain. And then lastly, chikungunya virus is another type of virus that can cause a high fever and joint and muscle pain. But in the case of this type of virus, the and muscle pain can become actually chronic arthritis. And these are just four of the different mosquito-borne diseases, and there are dozens upon dozens of them. So in total, there's about 700 million mosquito-borne infections every year and about 700,000 deaths per year. So that's a pretty significant burden on global health. But what are really required for these mosquito-borne disease transmission? Like we don't necessarily hear about this all of the time here in the Northeast. Well, one thing is that you have to have the correct mosquito species present. So you may think of like mosquitoes all look the same, they're just little bugs, but there's actually many different types of mosquito species, almost as if how you think about there's many different types of breeds of dogs. And when you have an insect species that is able to transmit a disease, that's referred to as a vector, which I'm going to come back to talking about later. So the requirements for the different mosquito-borne diseases to be transmitted, you have to first have the mosquito species present. Then you have to have a certain temperature range, which works for disease transmission. So mosquitoes are able to live all the way between about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, up to close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a really broad range. But in order to have transmission of disease, it has to be between about 73 degrees Fahrenheit and 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And then lastly, you have to have an animal species infected with the disease present in that area. So this can be humans, this can be monkeys or non-human primates. It can even be horses or birds, depending on the different type of disease. So you need to have all of these things together in one specific region. You need to have the mosquito species present, you need to have an infected animal, and you need to have the proper temperature in order to get transmission of this disease. So thinking about global warming and the changing temperatures that we are seeing around the world, this is a map that represents pretty recently, about 6 years ago, 2019, the different places in the world that would be suitable for disease transmission by a certain type of mosquito species. So in the places that have a darker red and even orange color, but darker red is the very most severe disease transmission, like 12 months out of the year. And then as you progress down to blue, that is further away from the equator, and maybe you can have 1 or 2 months a year of disease transmission, but not nearly as severe. So if climate change continues at the rate that we are currently seeing, and if global warming continues at the rate we are currently seeing, then by 2050, this map looks a little bit different. You have more red, and you also have the blue and the orange regions stretching further north away from the equator and further south away from the equator. And if we move even further into 2080 with projected climate change, the map looks even different. You have way up into even Canada, able to have some disease transmission. And you may also notice that compared to 2050 to 2080, there's a big difference in South America specifically. A lot of the areas that had been really, really red, a lot of disease transmission, it's actually not as much disease transmission way out in 2080. And that's because temperatures will have gotten too high, above 84 degrees during most of the year. So too high to allow for disease transmission. So that's what it looks like in the future, and it's not very good. However, we are way back at the 2019 mark, like things haven't changed a whole lot, but mosquito-borne infections are already increasing. So I want to look at those trends to talk about why this is really a problem that we need to be thinking about now, and it's not just something that will be affecting us in the future. So, taking a little trip through time over the past 12 years or so, the first disease that we're going to be looking at is the chikungunya epidemic that happened from 2013 to 2014. And chikungunya is the virus that can cause sometimes chronic joint pain or chronic arthritis. And between 2013 and 2014, there were over 1 million cases in the Caribbean. And this map shows that there are some other places in the world where there were also chikungunya outbreaks, but most of the cases were in the Caribbean during this 1 year. And you may think, well, this isn't something I remember hearing about necessarily, but if you're somebody who's living in that area, and if you got chikungunya, then between about 10 to 25% of the people who come down with chikungunya end up with that chronic arthritis. So imagine being a working adult and then all of a sudden having arthritis way before the age when you should be having arthritis. That'd be a significant problem. So then the next disease we're going to be talking about is the Zika epidemic that happened between 2015 and 2016. And this epidemic was mostly in South America, but also in Central America and also in the Caribbean. Oh, sorry. Um, and Between 2015 and 2016, there were over 700,000 cases within the Americas. And you may remember in around this time in the airports seeing signs that say, pregnant women, be careful of the mosquitoes because of Zika virus. And this is actually because pregnant women could have babies with birth defects, particularly with birth defects affecting the brain due to Zika virus infections. So that was also a significant threat to public health about 10 years ago. Then something that's a little bit closer to home is the 2019 Eastern equine encephalitis outbreak. And Eastern equine encephalitis is a mouthful, so we abbreviate it as EVE. But in 2019, there were 38 cases of EVE and there were 12 deaths. And 38 cases doesn't sound like a lot, but 12 deaths is a lot. This virus causes about a 30% fatality rate. So about 30% of the people who get infected with EVE end up dying from it. And then about half of those who survive end up having long-term or even lifelong neurological complications from the virus. And this virus in 2019 was mostly being transmitted up in the Northeast, so around Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, right around here. And you might remember seeing signs on the highway saying, wear mosquito protectant to protect yourself from this virus. So, and then something that to move away from the viruses and talk about malaria. In 2022, there was a significantly higher number of cases of malaria deaths and overall malaria cases, about a 6% increase or 7% increase in just 3 years from 2019 to 2022. And compared to these other outbreaks that we were talking about that lasted for just a year, this 6 to 7% increase may not seem like a lot, but malaria is really special because there have been decades upon decades of malaria eradication campaigns going on. And these eradication efforts had been relatively effective at decreasing the number of cases pretty consistently. And this was the first time from 2019 to 2022 that we had actually seen an increase in many, many years. And so despite the fact that all of the same efforts were going on, and despite the fact that these efforts have been successful at decreasing malaria cases before, during this time period, there was actually an increase. So that definitely could be due to global warming. And then most recently, this is a graph looking at an increase in dengue virus cases. So dengue virus causes a high fever and also joint pain, and in the most severe cases, internal bleeding that can even lead to death. And in this graph, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the total number of reported cases, and then along the bottom, we're looking at a timeline. So this is across a calendar year from January to December. And in 2024, which is the line represented in red, there was a 215% increase in the number of cases compared to just the year before in 2023, which is shown in blue. And then there was an almost 400% increase compared to the number of cases averaging over the past 5 years. So this is a significant change in the trend of dengue cases. And so far in 2025, we're still really early. We're still in February of 2025. But so far, there have been over 100 million cases worldwide and over 10,000 deaths from dengue. So this is something to keep our eye on in this year and in the coming times. So we've established that there is a rise in mosquito-borne diseases, but what can we do about it? So looking at how we can move forward, one thing that is pretty general for all of us to keep in mind is general climate awareness. How much pollution are we putting out? Are we taking public transportation? Are we recycling? The things that we can do to be responsible citizens. Another thing that you can do to protect yourself is use climate and health-friendly insecticides, particularly if you're in a region where there is a lot of transmission, like more tropical regions. And then something I'm going to be talking about in just a moment are some really exciting advances in vector control. So remember, the term vector means an insect species that is able to transmit a disease. And there's some novel methods of vector control that are really exciting. And then lastly, I'm also going to touch on some biomedical advances in the research field of how we can try to treat these diseases. So you may have heard about this chemical compound called DDT that was used from the 1940s to the 1970s, and it was really effective at killing mosquitoes, and it actually eliminated malaria in the US. Now, you may think malaria doesn't sound like it was a US problem, but actually 100 years ago, malaria was circulating in the US. And then DDT was made, and they had all of these cute little signs talking about how DDT is so good, and they were even advertising wallpaper for children's rooms so that any mosquito that lands on the wallpaper dies and then the child stays safe. And then you even have a little jingle saying that DDT is good for me. But it was determined in the 1970s that DDT was indeed not good for us because it had a negative effect on health, and it also had a negative effect on agriculture and on livestock and animals and food. And it was deemed to not be a suitable form of insecticide. And since then, there have not been any other types of chemical insecticides that can really be used at a wide scale so to protect us from these diseases and to protect us from mosquitoes. So since these chemical compounds have not proved to really be that possible, there has been alternative interesting modes of vector control that have been experimented with. And so one that I'm going to talk about is the Wolbachia method for mosquito control. And the idea of the Wolbachia method is the ability to decrease the mosquito population. So this is a really novel idea because Wolbachia is actually a type of bacteria. And so it's a type of bacteria that is able to live inside of the mosquito. And here you can see that there's a male mosquito that has these green Wolbachia living inside of it. And it's not like these Wolbachia make the mosquito sick. The mosquitoes are able to continue living their normal lives and they're just fine. But when the male mosquito that's infected with Wolbachia mates with a female mosquito who either has Wolbachia or does not have Wolbachia, the eggs that the female mosquito lays are not able to hatch. So essentially, male mosquitoes that are infected with Wolbachia are sterile. They're not able to mate with a female and produce any viable eggs. So over time, you have a decrease in the mosquito population. And if there's less mosquitoes, then there's less ability of the mosquitoes to transmit disease. But the Wolbachia method works in another way as well. It's actually really good at preventing the spread of disease. So as we can see in the top, the orange part, this is what happens when you have a normal mosquito that is able to transmit a disease. So the mosquito bites a person who is infected. The mosquito then ingests the blood of that person, and the disease is able to grow up inside of them. And then the mosquito bites another person who has the green shirt here. And then that person ends up getting sick, which is when they have the orange shirt. But when you have these mosquitoes that are infected with Wolbachia, when it bites an infected person who has the orange shirt on, then the mosquito ingests the blood that has the disease. The disease, in this case, the virus or malaria or whatever it is not able to survive inside of the mosquito. So when the mosquito bites another person, a healthy person who's in the green shirt, then that person no longer gets infected and they stay healthy. So, through this method, Wolbachia stops the disease from being transmitted. And the Wolbachia method that works in two ways, one producing non-viable offspring and like eggs that cannot hatch, and another way not allowing the mosquitoes to transmit disease. This has been shown to be promising because there are some parts of Australia, for example, that have already released mosquitoes that are infected with Wolbachia, and they've seen a decrease in the number of dengue cases there. So Wolbachia could be a promising method of vector control in the future. And then lastly, to talk about biomedical research advances, there are some promising new directions for vaccines. So one is that in the past year, there's been a new malaria vaccine that has been approved, and it is safe and it works well. And pretty soon, different places in sub-Saharan Africa that have a really high global burden or very high burden of malaria, they are going to be able to use this vaccine to hopefully help keep mostly children, but the whole population safe from malaria, hopefully. And then for dengue vaccines, there's actually two really promising types of dengue vaccines that are currently finishing up clinical trials. And my lab actually works to understand the immune responses in people to dengue vaccines to make sure that the vaccines are working well and being safe for people who get them. So just for fun, here's some pictures of me and my lab doing this work to understand immune responses to dengue. So thank you all very much for listening to talking about how climate change is affecting the growing ability of mosquitoes to spread disease and how we can deal with that. And now Grayson is going to talk a little bit more about how climate change is affecting us as humans and how we can get really creative with different ways to navigate these problems with climate change.
Hello. So my presentation is all about solar life, which are living solar panels. But really, what I want to talk about is how much I love algae. So the true title of my slides is Algae, Will You Be My Valentine? So what species are adapting to climate change? We've seen two examples so far. We've seen that owls or monkeys are. We've seen that mosquitoes are. And can you guys guess what else is? Well, we are. And actually every species is. But of course, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about us. And so why? And the reason is because we adapt in a very interesting way. So most species have to adapt in one singular way, which is just changing their behavior or potentially getting fatter, expanding the territory that they're in. But for us, we can go a slightly different way. And that is the whole part of my talk, which is that with science, humans can adapt to climate change in a way unlike any other species. So here's us. Well, more there's us. And there we are right in Danbury or in the surrounding area. And this was taken at 5:36 p.m. today. So only an hour ago or so. And there's something special about this, which I have to draw in, is that we have the sun. And in any given moment, 10,000 times more energy than we would use is being delivered by the sun. And so this is really powerful. And if we could actually harness this energy, then we could mitigate the climate change that is being caused by sort of these less green energy production methods. Because we know that solar panels deriving the energy from the sun, as opposed to fossil fuels or other ways that produce a lot of greenhouse gases, can actually help us reduce the effects of climate change by reducing climate change itself. And so in this presentation, I'm going to give you a very specific example of a solar panel that we're working on, and a few other examples too. But what I really want you to take away from this is how we can use science in all of these different features to really to adapt in a way unlike any other species. So we have solar, but there's also other ones. There is wind, there is geothermal, and all of these have a specific place because you don't want to put a solar panel where there is no light. You don't want to put a wind turbine where there is no wind. So all these have their specific place, but today we're going to focus on the solar panels. And solar panels all have to do, they really come down to this idea of cell efficiency, which is how much you can take a sun, or how much we can take the sun's energy, have it hit the solar panel, and then it produce energy. And if it does it not to a great extent, we would say that it has low cell efficiency. But if it hits a solar panel and creates a lot of energy, we'd say that's high cell efficiency. And the way that this is actually calculated is through this equation, in which its cell efficiency is equal to the energy out divided by the energy that we get in from the sun. So let's say we have 100 energy from the sun, it hits the solar panel, and we get 20 energy out. In that case, the cell efficiency would be 20 because it's 20 electrical energy that we're getting out that could be stored in the battery, divided by 100 energy that we're getting in the sun from the sun. Well, in that case, we have a 20% cell efficiency. And so striving for this goal of a high cell efficiency is what drives people to develop new types of solar panels and improve the ones that we already have. And there are actually a lot of different types of solar panels. There is the silicon solar panel, which the specific name doesn't matter, but it comes from a mineral or in the ground. And this is actually the one that if you are trying to buy solar panels for your roof or for any other purpose, you're probably going to get this one. It was the first one that was invented and also the most commonly found. But there's actually some other ones. There's dye solar panels, in which you actually take the dye, much like the dye that you can find in your shirt, and have that, since it naturally takes in a lot of the light, and you can actually use that as a way to collect the solar light. And we've actually found a way to turn that into a solar panel. And because you're using dye, which is very cheap, these solar panels are very cheap. And because it's dye, you can actually flex them. So you can make solar panel clothing out of it if you wanted to. And then on sort of the flip side, we have something called perovskite, which is a specific crystal that's engineered to be as efficient as we can get. And these are quite expensive, but they're very lightweight and they're very efficient. And so let's put this into context in terms of cell efficiency. So we have silicon here, and this is a graph that shows the year on the bottom and then also the cell efficiency. And so this is how efficient we have measured these solar panels to be as scientists gradually improve how efficient these solar panels are by changing the specific nuances in them to make them just ever so slightly more efficient. So with silicon, it started out in 1980 and only had about a 15% cell efficiency. But now we're in 2025, we're at about a 25% cell efficiency. What came next was the dye solar panel, which came out in about, around the 1990s. And it is now just reaching a cell efficiency of about 15%. But although this isn't as great as the silicon solar panel, remember that it's very cheap. And then finally, we have the perovskites, the newest solar panel in the land came out around 2010, and as of 2025, this year, has just barely become more efficient than our most efficient silicon solar panel. And so these all have pros and cons with them, but what we're really interested in is how we can develop all these new types of solar panels, because the more types of solar panels we have, the more we can actually specialize them. Like I said, the perovskite can be used for very lightweight spaces, like, for example, a space shuttle, where you really need where the weight of the space shuttle is very important. Or if you need a cheap thing, then you have Dyson-sized solar cells. But all these solar panels are great, but I really want to focus on one, which is algae. Because algae is kind of like a solar panel. So this is algae. If the sun hits the algae is happy. It can grow, it can live, because the algae will turn the sun's energy, the sun's light, into energy that the algae can use. But if the algae does not get sun, the algae is not happy. In fact, it's actually more than not happy, it's dead. So algae has had a pretty good incentive over the past 3 billion years to evolve to become more efficient at turning solar light, turning the sun into energy that it can use. So maybe we can actually use this. And so what if we just used the algae as the solar panel? This is great, but it's actually not that very efficient. Yes, it's been evolving over the past 3 billion years, but it's been evolving to give it itself energy. And we don't want it to give itself energy. We want it to take that solar light and to actually give that energy to a battery, which means it has to export that energy from inside the algae to outside in the water that the algae is in. And so what can we do about this? Well, I feel like modern philosophy would say that love is accepting someone for themselves, flaws and all. And I do love algae, but I did not get into grad school for my great relationship experience. And so we're going to reject that. Instead, we're going to see what can we actually do to improve algae and their solar panels. And this is going to be in 3 parts, and talking about how we can combine many different, seemingly different aspects of science to create a really good algae solar panel. And the first one we're going to talk about is ecology, because we can look at how bacteria can actually improve the efficiency of algae. So when algae is creating this electrical energy, it almost has a recipe associated with it. It will say, okay, I need 1 solar energy, and I need 1 chemical or I need some nutrient, which is denoted as that blue sphere. And then in return, I'll give you the electrical energy and the green spheres, which are other sort of byproducts that it creates on the way to creating electrical energy. Meanwhile, bacteria has a recipe of its own. It can create electrical energy or energy for its own self to continue living. And all it needs is actually the byproduct of the algae. And what it creates as its own byproduct is this blue sphere that in the nutrients that the algae needs. And so if you put them together, you actually will have algae creating the electrical energy, creating a byproduct, which the bacteria can then take, turn into its own nutrients, its own byproducts, give that to the algae, and then you actually get more ingredients for the algae to turn solar energy into electrical energy. And so what ended up happening, the researchers who did this are based in Spain, and what they found was they actually grabbed algae from their backyard and they accidentally infected the algae with bacteria, and were really like, oh my gosh, no, this is bad. We have an infection in the algae, but realize that you actually had this mutually beneficial relationship that gave them a 13.5 times improvement in the amount of energy the algae solar panel was creating. But this is not the only way that we can do it. We can instead look at genetic engineering, because genetic engineering has sort of supercharged many of the ways that we can look at, or the supercharge the ways that we use biology. And it has really improved a lot of systems that we've looked at. So what if we use genetic engineering to sort of supercharge our algae? Well, first, to understand how we would do this, we have to look a little more into how algae is converting solar energy into electrical energy. It does so like a series, almost like a series of factories. You have these factories, which I've labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these factories are what we call proteins. They're biological factories inside the algae. And the solar energy will go from the first factory. It will turn into something slightly different. That's not exactly what we want, but a little closer. And then that will be shipped to the second factory. And then that will do the same thing, bringing us a little closer to this electrical energy that we want. And then we can do that a few more times all the way until we get the actual electrical energy that we want. And this factory chain is called the electron transport chain. So these factories, these proteins, are not just little blobs. They are very complex, and they have a set of instructions provided to them by DNA, or the sort of the genetic code that can say exactly what the protein's going to do. And so let's say that for this first protein in the electron transport chain, the instructions we have is to convert energy at a slow speed. I don't know why the DNA would tell it to convert it at a slow speed. Seems counterintuitive. But with genetic engineering, what we can do is say, well, actually, let's do it at a fast speed. We can change the instructions. But we have to be careful with this, because not every change that we do is going to be helpful. In fact, some of them might be damaging. We might change it to be a very slow speed, or it might just make no sense at all. Convert energy library. Then the protein won't do anything at all. So how could we possibly figure out what these instructions are? Because the instructions that the DNA provides is not as neatly written in nice sentences, but we can get a sense of them. And especially and the way that we can get a sense of them is by looking at sort of the words that make up the instructions. And so these words in actuality are these biological parts, building blocks called amino acids. And so just for this example, in this first factory, this first protein, we have 5,298 amino acids, or the protein words. And so if these were words, that would actually look like about 14 pages of instructions. And in the protein dictionary, there's 20 amino acids. So we can think of it as there's 20 words in the protein dictionary. So if you wanted to think of every single combination of instructions that you wanted to give, that would be a lot. So much, in fact, that if you try to plug this into your calculator, it'll say undefined, which is the calculator's way of saying, I'm not doing that. That's too large. So how can we possibly figure out, if the calculator is not even willing to calculate how many possible sets of instructions that we can do, how could we ever figure out what is going to be the perfect instructions for us, especially because this is just one protein in the factory of them? Well, this is where computers can help, which brings us to our last science, and of computer science. So there's many different species, and many of them are very good at turning solar energy into electrical energy. And some will probably be a little worse. But what we can do is feed them all into this site called the Protein Data Bank and say, okay, here is the instructions that the DNA is giving these proteins, and here's actually how efficient they are. And then once we've compiled a big set of, okay, here's the DNA, here's the instructions, and here is how well they're performing, we can feed that into a computer to get a sense of, to try to find those patterns of, okay, what parts of these instructions are actually making this more efficient than something else. And once we do that, once we figure out what's going to be the most efficient, then we can put that all together to create sort of a superhero algae factory or protein that is really efficient at converting this solar energy into electrical energy. And so where does that sort of leave us? Well, in this example, we have used all of these different sciences to make a very efficient algae solar panel. And the reason that we actually wanted to do this in the first place is because algae is algae. You can literally get it from your backyard, which is much easier to get than, say, manufacturing a very complicated silicon solar panel or perovskite solar panel. And so if we're able to use all these sciences, then we're able to make a very efficient solar panel. And this is just one way that we can use science to improve a very small fraction of what's going to help us, of a very small fraction of solar panels, because there's all these other types. And solar panels in itself is just one small fraction of what makes up renewable energy, because there's geothermal energy, there's wind energy. And renewable energy itself is just one of the many ways that we can adapt to climate change. And so science is sort of this great way that we can really optimize and really adapt to climate change. And it's so powerful even in this very small example. So the sort of takeaway of all of this is that life is in flux. Our changing climate forces all species to change their behavior, from monkeys to mosquitoes to us. But as climate changes, so does our ability to adapt. And so this is just me working with lasers and holding up a little bit of algae. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And